begin. Got it. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. My name is Susan Barber, and I curate this community education program this morning. And no matter how many plans we all make for how things are going to go, as all of us that work in end-of-life care know that none of those actually end up working out the way we think they're going to. And sometimes this translates to everyday life. There was a back-end change today on, or recently on Zoom, and Ken Ross, who manages our Zoom, is in Singapore with the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. And so I'm going to just introduce the foundation for all of you who may be joining us for the first time. My name is Susan Barber. I curate the community education program here for the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. And I'm very grateful to do that. For those of you that this may be new to you, or you may not know a lot about the foundation, the foundation was set up just the year after Elisabeth died, and this is to honor her work. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization that was inspired by the life of psychiatrist, humanitarian, and hospice pioneer Dr. Elisabeth Kübler-Ross. And though people often refer to Elisabeth as the death and dying doctor or the creator of the 5 steps, she referred to herself as the life and living lady. There are few people I know that have lived a life more robust and engaged than Elisabeth. And it's in the spirit of embracing all of life, which includes death, that we further the mission and the vision of Elisabeth through the work of the foundation. The foundation has chapters all over the world now, and currently is developing a compassionate community program with St. Luke's Hospital in Singapore, has recently opened an 18-bed respite center in Guatemala for cancer patients. They're providing free medical services for those who are navigating chemotherapy and radiation. The foundation in Chile initiated the first pediatric hospice there. We're developing programming with Stanford University, and the list goes on and on and on. So we are very grateful to all of you who join us. For those of you that are in a position that can make a donation, we are incredibly grateful. That's how this is supported. And I'd encourage anybody that is with us today just to put into the chat where you are Zooming in from. That is always wonderful when we see that there are actually people from all over the world that join us for these. And I want to just take a minute to introduce Barbara Karnes. Many years ago in 2015, when I was at Mission Hospice in California doing my first community education event, Barbara was the person that we hosted. We crammed 85 people into our tiny our community conference room, and had one of the best days in our hospice program. Mission Hospice still talks about that day. So I'm grateful that all of these years later, Barbara is still talking about end-of-life care, talking about death, dying, loss, and grief, and talking about ways that we all can become more comfortable for our time when we will be a patient, when we will be someone who is dying, but also for the people that we will be caring for. Barbara's an RN, an award-winning end-of-life educator and nurse. She's the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization's Hospice Innovator Award winner for 2018. And in 2015, Barbara was named the International Humanitarian Woman of the Year. One of the things Barbara has written extensively, beautiful booklets and books about end-of-life care, and we'll be sending those resources to all of you at the end of this when we send out the recording, which will probably be sometime in the next week or so. Her books and DVDs about death and dying really are changing people's lives, particularly caregivers who are often in situations that are unfamiliar to them. And one of the things I have loved about Barbara's work is that she's able, in very concise and clear language, to explain things that are sometimes hard to understand, or people don't understand what's happening. And so today we are welcoming you all. Barbara, I'm going to turn this over to you to introduce yourself at greater length. And we're going to encourage people to see you, to encourage you to put any questions that you may have. If you've been a caregiver, if you are someone who's navigating an illness, please do put any questions you have up in the chat. This we'd like to have be pretty interactive today. You're also welcome to use the chat feature or the Zoom feature for raising and lowering your hand, which can be found at the bottom or the top of your screen under reactions. Often it's there or more. If you're just raising your hand like this, I won't be able to see you, but I do look forward to seeing you putting your hand icon up so that we're able to have everybody that would like to ask a question able to do that. So if anybody would like to put questions up, please do that. Barbara, I'd like to just maybe begin this conversation. Just when we got on, I was telling Barbara that a very dear friend to all of us at Mission Hospice and to people in the cystic fibrosis community around the world and the transplant community around the world, Isabel Stenzel Burns died last Wednesday morning. She was one of my dearest friends and work friend for many, many years. And watching her navigate her illness and the way she wanted it handled. Of course, those of us that work in hospice always think hospice is going to be the answer to everything. And in Isabel's case, because of her medical history, she chose to try to stay alive for as long as she possibly could, and enrolled in hospice and died within 24 hours of enrolling in hospice. And so she really timed it down to the last minute. She had a lot that she wanted to still do. But that for me just brought this home really in a way, makes this much more poignant, these types of conversations. And several of the times when I was with Isabel, I could hear my sort of hospice brain thinking, why aren't you going to hospice now? Why aren't you going to hospice now? And what was so beautiful is that this training we've had for so many years about meeting people where they are is what really rose to the top, and meeting Isabel where she was and understanding that she absolutely understood what she was doing and how she wanted to do that, and watching that process and the beautiful support by her husband, Andrew, was just a reminder that everybody's death is so unique and everybody's death needs to be honored in the way that they want it to be honored and supported. And so I can't think of a better person to have this morning with us for this conversation. So Barbara, if you would like to go ahead, I'm going to remove myself here from this spotlight. I'd encourage people, I think that this is spotlighted so that everybody would see Barbara and probably me when I put myself back in here. But Barbara, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and anything else that you would like to say.
Okay. Make a note. When your friend, we die the way we've lived. And what you described is absolutely, she died within 24 hours once she realized she was going to die. Up to that point, she was trying to live. But there comes a point where we know inside of ourselves, I'm going to die. And that's the point that she then got on hospice and did her job. Boy, she just did the work. So we die according to our personality. And I wanted to, that just fit so great as you were talking. My allergies are awful, so you'll know that I sniffle and carry on, and just, I'll warn you ahead of time, like that. Who am I? As a nurse, I started in hospice thanks to Elisabeth Kübler-Ross and her interest. She sparked my interest. And I, as a nurse, had never worked in the medical arena. So I went to work for hospice when doctors couldn't even say the word right. They often called it hospic. I went to work and knew nothing about how people die, because up to that point, we Americans did an interesting cycle. And that cycle is in up to about the 60s, Grandma died at home, you know, and the family was there. We gathered there and we watched Grandma die. And it was a natural part of life, is that we watched birth and we were there at the bedside for death. Then our medical knowledge increased, hospitals changed, and people began in hospitals. And when they died in the hospital, they were generally at the room at the end of the hall, and no one saw what was happening. Then we went from the hospital to nursing facilities, and our people died in nursing facilities. And again, they were generally alone. I think we're coming full circle now. And that is that more and more people are coming home to die. And with that, we're recognizing the normality. Dying is not a medical event. It's a social, communal event. And we're bringing that back. So we've come full circle. What I started out to say and got sidetracked is that those 5 years that I was a primary care hospice nurse, I then went on into administration and teaching, but the first 5 years, all my patients died, and they taught me what it was like to die, because nobody really medically knew, because no one medical was there, except for emergency type situations. But those 5 years taught me how people die, and that there's this normal, natural process that occurs months before death from disease. And I look back over my many years in end of life field, and I realized that my patients and their families during those 5 years were the teachers. They're the ones that taught me how people die.
Thank you so much, Barbara. I was thinking about when you were talking, recently we've been working, a group of us, in a prison hospice that Elisabeth also was responsible for the founding of. She had called a mutual friend many years ago and asked them to go up and support a group of men in a prison who had AIDS. And when our friend Irene found that group of men and went to the prison, she realized pretty soon after that everybody that was going to be joining that group, to a support group for AIDS, was going to actually be dying. And so they decided instead, over many years, that a hospice would be more appropriate. And so a hospice was founded, and really they allowed the men, we're training incarcerated men to be peer supporters of their peers who are dying in the prison. And this training is such a wonderful partnership, because we're learning so much from the people that we're training about how this works in a prison environment, and just being able to be available for people, meeting them again, this idea of meeting people where they're at, and supporting people in the way that they need to be supported, and not in the way that I think or some other people think that they need to be supported, but really deeply listening to what it is that's happening for that person. And we have a friend in hospice, and her name is Diane Gill, and she's just retired after 40 years of hospice nursing. And any training she did, she would talk about hospice being the laying on of ears, that our job in hospice is really to listen deeply to what people will tell you who they are pretty quickly. They'll tell you what they need. And then so often we spend all of this time trying to do something that's better for them, or really what they need or what they don't know they need. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk about this. This is such a common situation for families, I think, to find themselves in, where there's multiple people, multiple opinions, multiple ideas about how this person's death should be handled, sometimes not asking them at all, sometimes just kids or a spouse having differences of opinions. And I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit about how you navigate that, or how you've helped families navigate that.
Well, excuse me. I think that there's two factors. One is developing a relationship, a trust with the families and the significant caregivers, as well as the patient, so that they appreciate the input that you're giving them. I think that's really important. And the education that you're bringing, because we don't have any role models on what it's like to die. And so we just have the movies, and that's not how people die. And families are, number one, terrified that someone they love is going to die in their home. They're grieving before death ever comes. There's so much emotion that is in the home, and that emotion is coming from the patient. The emotion is coming from the caregiver and all the family members. And as you pointed out, not everyone's on the same page. And so hospice has to use their people skills to try and teach the family that mom's doing a good job, that this is what it's like to die, and to be available to talk and to listen to all of those family members. And then here's the hard part for the caregiver, for the professional caregiver, is we do all that we can to educate, to guide in what we think as the caregiver is the best way for the family to deal with this, in our professional opinion. And here's the hard part. We then have to step back and let the family and the patient do it their way. And it may be, we may stand there and think, oh my gosh, this is the hardest thing for this family if they would just do it this way. But to support them, to be there and to guide them, even if we feel they're doing it the wrong way. And that's big for us, the caregiver.
Yes, that is always a challenge. That is it's so hard. And I think especially for those of us who have a long, experience or relationship with hospice or end-of-life care, it really is hard for us to sometimes, I'm speaking strictly for myself, when you know that something that could be so useful, like just even having people sign up for hospice, that it could be so useful and so supportive, not just to that person who is experienced this illness and navigating their own end-of-life experience, but for their families, that it is really hard to not offer our opinion or offer our expertise. I've been looking.
I think I think our job is to offer. Our job is to explain and to try, operative word, try to guide that family in so that they may have this sacred experience. The trick is to be able to still be there, to still listen, to still support, even as the family chooses what we consider a hard way.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful reminder. I'm wondering, Barbara, I know that you are working with a group now to really provide resources for caregivers who are working at end of life. And I'm wondering if you could, I've seen in some of your blogs, just responding to questions. These are sort of the perennial questions that families have or patients have coming into hospice. things like, well, I don't want hospice because they're just going to come with morphine and kill mom. We had a patient say that to us because that's what the doctor told them. And that's why the doctor told them they were waiting for as long as possible for the person to come into hospice. And while hospice has changed quite a lot from the way it had originated in terms of mostly not-for-profit, mostly community-based, there are a lot of things that have changed about hospice, but there's also a lot of real benefits to having hospice available. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about what some of those are for people that may not be aware. And then there's a question actually in the chat that we'll get to about, could you describe for people clearly that, like we've talked about, there's a couple of ways people can go, either really quickly, sudden death, or a prolonged illness that has some stages that are fairly recognizable. I'm wondering if you could kind of address both of those things.
Sure. I'll start with the last question because I've already forgot the first one. But there are just two ways to die, as you said, gradual or fast. And gradual death is disease or old age. And that in gradual death, the body does certain things at certain times. Some people will do everything that I've learned, that we've learned about approaching end of life. Some people will do none of it, but most people will do at least some of the things I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to say, as a medical professional, you don't even have to know a person's diagnosis to know if they have entered the dying process. I want to say dying is not a medical event. It is a communal event. You don't even have to know the diagnosis. What you're going to look for are three things: a person's eating habits, their sleeping habits, and their social ability. Starting with their eating habits, 2 to 3 to 4 months before death from disease occurs. Add just time for old age. So 2 to 3 to 4 months, a person stops eating meat. And then pretty soon it's fruits and vegetables. And on this continuum, as they move closer to death, they eat less and less. You reach a point where they're eating soft foods. Then you're doing good if you can get Ensure Plus down them. Ice cream, oh, we love our ice cream. Ice cream, you can almost get it clear to the end, but you will reach a point where you're doing good if you can get sips of water or Gatorade down a person. That is normal, and yet we have such a hard time with that. You know, we associate food with so many things. So that is a big area of understanding that we need to give our families and support. The second thing is sleeping. Again, 2, 3, 4 months before death from disease, a person starts taking an afternoon nap. And then pretty soon it's a morning and an afternoon nap. And then they're asleep all evening in front of the TV. You wake them up and they go to bed and they sleep all night. And then one day they don't get out of bed and they're asleep more than they're awake. The third thing is socialization. Socialization starts with the guy that follows soccer and this new soccer player that's coming. Not interested anymore. Doesn't even ask. And then it's, you know, don't have the neighbor ladies come over, the church ladies come over. I'm too tired. And then it's, don't have the grandkids come over. And gradually they completely withdraw and go within. And that's what they should do because they're processing their life. They're saying, what have I done? Who have I touched? And that work can only be done by one. And as they get closer to death, they go completely within and they continue to do their life processing work. If you think about it, life is a billion-piece jigsaw puzzle. and they're trying to put all those pieces together. So now there is a point 1 to 3 weeks before death where what I call labor begins. And that's totally different things. You walk into the room and you look at this person and they're sleeping with their eyes partially open. They're doing start and stop breathing. They're picking the air, the random hand movements. Those things say labor has begun. And that's 1 to 3 weeks before death. And then there are other changes when the actual birth into the other world occurs.
Thank you so much, Barbara. Mary Rose is asking if you could give a description of the good process of death after a long illness. And I would say that what you described, now I'm hesitant always to say good or bad death. I think death is really deeply connected to the person that's experiencing it. And so judging that it was good or bad, it might be good or bad for me as the caregiver or the friend who's observing it, but as the person who is navigating that. But I think you have just described, particularly after long illness, typically how death would arrive is that that process. Somebody's asking if you can give a lethal dose of morphine to someone, and why do people report that morphine or hospice killed their family member?
Oh, that's so big. I write a lot of blogs about that because I hear it every week. I get an email or a letter from someone saying hospice killed my mom. They gave her morphine and she died. So it's a long topic, but I'll try and put it in a few words. Dying is not painful. Disease causes pain. And if disease is part of the medical history, then you're going to medicate that person until their last breath. Because just because a person's non-responsive doesn't mean that they're not experiencing pain. So if pain is part of the disease process, then narcotics are very appropriate, and they may have to be increased because the body is shutting down and not working well. If someone says to me, hospice gave mom morphine under her tongue and 30 minutes later, mom was dead, hospice killed her. No, that morphine's probably still under her tongue, because the closer a person is to death, the less their body is functioning. And so everything isn't working like it used to. They're not processing oxygen the way they used to. Their blood isn't circulating. Their kidneys aren't working properly. So if you get a narcotic and death follows within even a couple of hours, I would say that the narcotic did not cause that death. Because I think that part of the confusion comes from a lack, I'm going out on a limb here, a lack of education by the healthcare providers. Mm-hmm. I think that we have to teach our families about pain medicine, about morphine. We have to sit down with them and have a talk. And because most of the concerns, and everyone's concerned with the way the world is today and all the addiction, but dying is different than care for the dying is different than care for someone who's going to get better. But if we don't educate our families in the difference, then our work is judged by how someone gets better, and then we've failed. So education, education, education is so important. And I think if we take the time to explain narcotics to the families, then we aren't going to have as many of hospice killed my mom.
Yeah. Let's see, we have a question here from somebody who lives in a small community where she is a hospice volunteer. They're caring for a woman whose daughter is also a hospice volunteer. So this person that's asking the question knows the daughter and the mom, and there's a conflict between the two of them. And this person is very concerned because she feels that if this isn't resolved before the mom's death, that their daughter is going to have a really hard time. And she is, seems like it came on fairly suddenly, and this wasn't a long illness. This was related to a fall and a sudden change in health status. And she's looking for some advice.
All you can do is what you can do, is support, be there for that family, try to be the stabilizing factor in that family and the relationship, be a listener, but you're not going to be able to solve the conflict that's going on between mother and daughter. That probably has, not even probably, it has taken a lifetime for those women to build the relationship that they have. And remember, not all relationships are positive. In fact, all relationships have good times and difficult times. And as death approaches, our personalities, whether caregivers or patients, our personality doesn't change. It actually intensifies. So if we have the opportunity, not everyone takes it, but we have the opportunity to change the dynamics of the relationship in the months before death. It's got to be the caregiver, the daughter, the person that's healthy has to take the first steps because the patient doesn't have the energy to do that. So it is we who are supporting opportunity to take that relationship to a more positive level.
How do we get out of here?
Doesn't always happen. And excuse me, but we can support and encourage conversation and communication.
Barbara, thank you so much. I can't help but think about my own mother-daughter conflict with myself and my mother for 62 years. I'm going to just mute. Thank you. Just be careful of unmuting. There's somebody that just joined us that's going into unmute there. We had 62 years of conflict and just not understanding each other. And when I arrived at her apartment, I knew that she was going to die soon. My other siblings, I don't think understood that. And I stood outside of her door for at least 5 minutes, not wanting to turn the knob to go into her apartment because I was so conflicted about our relationship and how bad it had been all of this time. And I heard my niece, she was 8 at the time, inside. I thought, okay, my brother and his wife are here from LA already. Okay, I'm not going to be alone in there. I'll go in. And when I opened the door, my niece was sitting on my mother's recliner. My mother was still able to be up in her chair then, with her arm around her. And she just said, you know, Grandma, I just love you so much. I just love you. And I don't know what happened for me in those minutes. I feel like I'm going to cry even now, almost 3 years later, that it was so clear to me that that was the only way forward. Whatever conflicts that I had with my mother, those 62 years, I was welcome to carry those on for the rest of my entire life if that's how I wanted to engage. But for this current time that I was going to be in that room, in that apartment with my mother and family, that love was the only way forward. And I am grateful for all the training I've had. Stephen Levine used to kid me, well, you've come to 130 of these workshops. Have you learned anything yet? I would have to say, yes, I did. Yes, I did learn something. And I learned that that is true. Love is the only way. And it was, it wasn't like I decided this, something just switched for me. And my mother had the same experience. And within a couple of days, she said to me, Susan, I'm so sorry. And I was like, I'm so sorry too, Mom. And I have to say, like, people say this a lot, but it's a very different lived experience. I realized sitting bedside with her in the 10 days it took her to die, and really loving her in a very profound way that I never thought possible, that the conflicts that I had with my mother was because we were so similar in so many ways. And sitting there at her deathbed is when I got to see that in full focus, because there were no words. We were rarely speaking with each other. There was no energy for that. There was just energy really to love each other in that time. And there's not a formula for how that happened, none of that, but I'm just incredibly grateful that when she died, that had been the experience. And I credit my 8-year-old, well, she's almost 13 now, my niece, for that, because she was so clear. I love you, Grandma. That's the way forward through this. So thank you.
I have to tell you a story, because this fits in so well with your story. My mother and I had a rocky relationship. She came to live with me the last 5 months of her life. And one day, as I'm taking care of her, I thought, I don't love this woman. I don't even like her. I don't love her. So I was just devastated with this knowledge. And I called my hospice social worker and said, Diane. And she came right over, and we go in the bedroom, and I'm crying and sobbing and oh. And when I was finished, she just listened. When I was finished, she said, Barbara, you do love your mom. Love is a verb. It's an action word. You are doing love for your mom and with your mom. And it was such a powerful, love is a verb. It isn't a feeling, it's a verb. Now, if it's a noun, it's a feeling, but it can be an action word. Love it. I wanted to share that.
That is so beautiful, Barbara. Thank you. It's so spot on. There's a question here from somebody whose mom was diagnosed with Lewy body dementia last year. She's 72. It's very progressive, and now she's crying because she doesn't have the language or the cognitive resources to be able to express herself. She's starting to escape the home, I would imagine. She's losing weight. And this daughter is very afraid of sending to a memory care center because she's afraid her health will decline more. Her sister's the primary caregiver and very exhausted by this experience. And how do you caregive and see the signs with the dementia disease?
I will talk about dementia and dying. All right, I'm thinking maybe that's what we're leading up to here. The rules, the general end of life rules, don't apply to dementia. You know, I talked earlier about eating, sleeping, and socialization. And that you look at those and you can kind of gauge where a person is in the dying process. Dementia doesn't play by the rules. A person can be sleeping all the time for years. A person can be withdrawn all the time for years. It isn't until eating becomes an issue. If we don't eat, we don't live. And so with dementia, when a person forgets how to swallow, they hold the food in their mouth or they start choking, you know, that's the moment. And if you don't have a feeding tube, and I don't recommend a feeding tube, but that's the moment when they're not taking in enough calories to run the body, that the dying process will begin. What to do during that time before the years of the person withdrawing, the emotional drain on the caregivers and the family, our medical environment does not address the needs of the many, many families and people that have dementia. They don't fit into the hospice mold. They don't fit into home health mold. They're kind of just over here all by themselves. Excuse me. And I hope that at some point our medical establishment, our Medicare program, our payer source will come up with a way of supporting families and people with dementia. None of us want to put our loved one in a memory care unit or in a nursing facility. We don't want to do that. But sometimes that's the only thing we can do. And when that happens, when it's the only thing you can do, then be sure and visit, be sure and love, and don't abandon, which often happens, the person. Just because I don't recognize you and just because I sit in my chair and don't move doesn't mean a part of me isn't aware that someone is there and loves me. And sometimes it's just sitting in the chair and holding their hand. Sometimes it's just walking in the door and saying, "Hi, Mom, I'm here." So we have to shift gears in the relationship. You have to continue to love them through being the verb, using the verb.
Barbara, I was just thinking, this is such a hard thing for people to think about placing a family member, especially if they love them. It's maybe sometimes easier, or many times. Well, we did actually. My mother went to a assisted living place to live our last 3 or 4 years of her life. But I'm thinking about a woman I worked with for many years who was a chaplain, very devoted to her patients. And when she retired, she went back to Illinois, one, so she could buy a home, which she was never able to do in California, and two, so that she could be closer to her mother who had dementia. And sadly, after she returned home, within a matter of less than a year, she was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. So now, instead of helping her sister who was caring for her mom, now her sister was burdened with thinking, oh, my sister's going to die of pancreatic cancer, and I have my mom with dementia. And bless Linda's heart, she lived for years, longer than anybody thought she could live with pancreatic cancer. And after a couple of years, her mother, of course, her dementia got worse, and she's having more and more difficulty. The caregivers were there. This was all during, of course, the pandemic. And eventually the sisters decided that they, against all of their better judgment, they needed to place their mom. And they found a place, a memory care place nearby, and placed her. And they were encouraged not to visit the first week, but then to come and visit, which they did as soon as they were able to see her. And they were shocked at how much better their mother was doing in this place. She was relaxed. She was engaged in the way that she could engage with other people her age. And they started really thinking about it. And they started thinking about the experience their mom had had in their home, which they thought, there was a lot of things that, this was her mother's home. Then she started thinking how much more stressful it might have been for her mother having dementia to be looking around at things that she may have felt like should be familiar, but weren't, couldn't place things, didn't really, they sort of were familiar, but not. Very limited social engagement. The caregivers were wonderful, but here she was in an environment where everything was really geared to people that were experiencing dementia in some form or another. Very simple, very easy to get along there. And she had a great time. I think her mom's still alive. Linda died, but her mom is still doing great in the facility. This happened to another friend of mine who had to place her mother at 100. And her mother's 102 and a half now with dementia, still living in a facility where people are engaged with her and people visit. And it's very easy for her mother to navigate the things she needs to navigate. So, I think I've had to really reset what I think about facilities, going to see the place that my mother lived in, and also just hearing these stories, particularly with people with dementia who were placed out of their home that they've been in for years, suddenly seem to be relaxed and doing better in some way. So for families that are, in that situation, my heart breaks. It's very hard. And I just really encourage you to think as broadly as you possibly can and see what could possibly work. There's a woman saying that when her husband was in hospice, that the hospice program came to see them often, and that the staff, the nurses in particular, were so wonderful and explained the reasons that they felt that morphine would be most useful. They answered any question that she had, and she felt that it was really a great experience. So back to that, yes, education, right? And asking questions.
And thank you for sharing that.
Yes.
Because it's easy to tell the negative side. And I really appreciate hearing that.
And Jill is sharing here that her dad has Lewy body dementia with Parkinson's also, and that they placed him in a group home where it seems that he's doing well, and that for the family, it's 100% better than placing him in a nursing home situation. This is all people with some form of dementia, and the care there is really great. Lots of thank yous for what you shared, Barbara, particularly about your mom. A woman sharing that her mother didn't acknowledge her, telling her she loved her at the end of her mother's life. And that is always a difficult thing. Oh, let's talk about finger food at end of life and with dementia.
Whatever works. I mean, oftentimes, excuse me, oftentimes it's like you go through stages, and in the months before death, whether it's dementia or not, eating is hard work. And so the simpler we make it, the easier we make it, the bigger chance we have of giving them nourishment. And so as long as a person with dementia isn't choking on the food, is swallowing the food, then finger foods may be the easiest way for them to get food in their mouth. And go for it, do what works. And it can be unconventional, doesn't make any difference. Do what works.
Somebody's asking, Deb is asking ideas on how to most effectively respond to a family member who says, I just can't bear to see my mother this way, or that's the case of people with dementia. That's not my mother anymore, or father or sibling. Or how would you respond to somebody that's in that situation?
Would say
that way.
Yes, that's not the mother or father that you recognize, that you grew up with. But mom and dad, their essence is in there. And we are so much more than our physical body. So I want you to look beyond the physical, beyond the intellectual, and know that inside is mom's spark, dad's spark is still there. And nurture that spark that's within. You don't recognize this physical vehicle and what's coming out of it, but in there, mom's there, and that's what you honor. That's the verb that you give mom.
Thank you, Barbara. This is reminding me of a story with one of my best friends, Bill, who was dying of dementia due to AIDS when he was just 40 years old back in the late 80s, early 90s. And he was in a hospital where they did not know what to do with him at all at those days. They gave him a chemical straitjacket by giving him so much medication that he didn't know where he was, and then they put a physical straitjacket on him. So when I arrived at the hospital in the morning, he was straitjacketed up. He had no idea what was going on, and he was very drugged, which appalled me. We ended up moving him to a different floor in the hospital and getting him ready to be sent out to a hospice. And his the way that his dementia landed was anger and paranoia. So he was always angry and almost always paranoid. So I was with him at the hospital the night before we were moving him, and he had been angry because he didn't understand much of anything that had been said to him. They had met with him several times that day to tell him he was moving without anybody there that could help interpret that for him. So when I got there, it took until 2 a.m. to really get him settled till he could go to sleep. And he laid back in his bed finally. I was like, oh my God. And they had put a bed in the room for me. So I was in that bed. Within 15 minutes, he is like, Susan, we have to get up. It's Saturday. We have to do the shopping. And he was a man of habit. This is a guy that should have been born in another time. He was such an elegant man. And every Saturday he had a checklist of things that he did, no matter what. And I knew this checklist, and I woke up at 2 a.m, just like, I can't even believe this is going to happen right now. And I said, honey, here's your socks. Why don't you try to put on your socks, which I knew he couldn't do. And so he finally laid back in the bed. He said, I can't go, but you have to. And I said to him, honey, it's okay, because tomorrow is actually not Saturday. It's Wednesday. And he laid back in his bed, and I thought, oh God, here we go again. He looked like he was going to just go off. And he said to me, Susan, there's a lot of things that people stand outside of, and reality is one of them. And he explained the time-space continuum to me as a convenience for people who were in a 3D body like I was still in. But to him, who was half in and half out of his body, like a mezzanine going up and down on an elevator. And sometimes he got off on one floor and sometimes he got off on another floor. But to assure me that the world, in fact, was not a linear process that I expected it to be, but it was much different in the way that he was now living and soon to die. And I was sitting there at 2 o'clock in the morning, like, oh my God, I haven't lived in California long enough. I can't even believe this is happening. And then he said to me, the other thing that you need to know is that when you come in here, I know it's important to you that you're Susan. And when Bernice, his other best friend, comes, I know it's important to her, she's Bernice. But what I want you to know is that when you come in and when she comes in, love comes in. And then he waved his hand out to the doorway. He goes, and these other people, they don't have the time of day for me. And so I want to just encourage, like what you're saying about the essence or the spark of the person that's still there. Sometimes you can see it by playing music that's something they remember from their teenage or early 20s. They'll come up and be like, oh my gosh. For Bill, this occasion to inform me about where he was kind of at in his process and what he was experiencing the reality to be compared to what I was experiencing it to be, is a reminder that I've talked about in every hospice training I've ever done, that, people with dementia, to still pay attention, to listen, because there may be times where they're saying things that may sound bizarre, but that explanation that he gave me was the closest I've ever come to hearing what it's like on the other side. Like that, and that so important that what the essence that we bring in, or if we're bringing love, if we're bringing frustration, if we're bringing aggravation, if we're bringing like, I can't deal with this another minute, that's just like, it's just picked up immediately. And to do whatever we can do. This is when self-care becomes not just something like, oh, we should do this, but really important, because how we show up at the bedside is perceived so clearly, especially by people with dementia, that it's important that we really are taking care of ourselves and we're not coming to the bedside with anger and frustration. There are some more questions here. We have a question about, for a loved one with dementia who does not have the skills to communicate, how do you know, or how does hospice know when they might need pain medication, when they're in pain, or what they might need, because she does not want her father to be in pain and he has dementia?
Excuse me. Dementia is not known for a lot of physical pain. So that's one thing. You want to look at the history, which will tell you what the pain level and if it's been present in the past. But in the moment, because if a person can't say to you, my leg hurts, you're going to look at the body language and are they rubbing their leg? Are they agitated? the body language can speak as loudly as words. It can often be truer than words, because I know a lot of people who will say, I'm fine, when they're not. But you look at the body language. And so in relationship to pain, I'd say you got to look and let your eyes be your guide as to whether the person is in pain. But I have to say again, just because a person is dying does not mean they are in pain. So you want to look at a disease history. And oftentimes, you don't need a narcotic. Maybe you just need a couple of ibuprofen. Maybe you need a Percocet to address the pain. Just because someone is in pain doesn't mean you jump right into a narcotic.
Thank you. And Barbara, somebody also offered the pain advanced dementia scale, a nonverbal pain scale that can be used to assess for somebody that has advanced dementia, or sometimes they use it for pediatrics. It's a pediatric equivalent. Let's see. And one woman, I mean, this is something I think that you probably hear a lot of. It's this sort of idea about hindsight is 2020, or what we know after the death, or what we wish we had done. And Louise is writing that the hardest thing for her husband had radiation to his throat for decades before he died. He was otherwise an extremely healthy man, but he became unable to swallow anything at all due to a fear of aspiration. And he had asked her for applesauce and ice cream, but she didn't give it to him when he came home from the hospital for hospice. And he had no nutrition once he came home from the hospital. I know it wouldn't have saved his life because he was close to 100, but maybe it would have comforted him. And I'm just wondering maybe what you say to people who, when somebody dies and then there's all of these like hindsight things, because it's not uncommon.
Sorry. It's not uncommon. After our loved one is gone, I think it's very normal in our grief to have, I wish I had, I should have, we carry those with us. What I recommend for people to anyone whose loved one or not loved one has died is to write them a letter and put down in that letter everything you want to say to that person. All your I wish I had, all I should haves, all of I didn't mean to, everything that you're carrying in your heart about this person, this relationship, put it down on paper. Let the tears flow, write the positive, write the negative. And then it can be pages and pages, it can be a sentence, it can be a paragraph, whatever your heart directs you to do. And then fold that letter up and burn it and scatter the ashes to the wind, and let go of all that should-haves and would-haves and all those emotions, and let how well you live your life going forward be the gift that you give the person that's gone.
Barbara, can you talk a little bit about somebody's asking maybe if the person isn't in pain, but how would we know if they have anxiety, if they have dementia, or if they're nonverbal? Can you give anti-anxiety medications liberally?
I only know dementia at end of life, so I don't know dementia before that happens. So I'm not a good person to say, yes, you can do this or that, because I really don't know. My area is end of life, and I know that dementia at end of life is different. So I don't know. And most as end of life approaches, there isn't really the anxiety of I'm going to die, be like there is in someone who doesn't have dementia, who recognizes the deterioration, the changes, the withdrawal. And so I don't know how. There's a wonderful woman named Mary Ann Oglesby, and she's developing a dementia doula program. And she's my go-to person for dementia. So you might think about her.
Yeah, I also love, I don't know, Barbara, if you know Teepa Snow, her work
Yeah.
with dementia, and particularly for people caring for those with dementia and caregiver behaviors that can really either thwart or enhance the experience that the person with dementia is having. Anti-anxiety, I often wonder how many people around the person that's experiencing anxiety are actually having anxiety. And if that person is just like the symptom, they're just showing everybody's anxiety. I've often thought if the people around the bed, and in times myself included, had been medicated for anxiety, the person in the bed probably wouldn't have been anxious at all. But we won't know about that part. Somebody also is asking what medications are commonly given during the last few days of life to help maintain comfort and pain management. Can you also talk a little bit about what is known as the death rattle, and are there any medications that can help with this?
I can talk about the death rattle, which is simply congestion in the lungs. And oftentimes positioning will help. But the body is shutting down and it's not functioning normally. And the fluid is kind of stagnant in the lungs. And then from the lungs, that fluid can also be in the back of the throat. And oftentimes you're just hearing them breathe through this fluid that's in the back. Suctioning is not the answer. If you're taking care of someone who's going to get better and they have fluid in the back of their throat, then suctioning may help. But for the death rattle or someone who is dying with a lot of fluid, you're not going to get it out. You're not going to get far enough, and you're really going to make them more uncomfortable in their dying process by suctioning them. Oftentimes just positioning, turn them over on their side or just change how they're lying in the bed often makes a difference. There are medications that can dry a person up, but really if someone has the death rattle, at most you're talking a few days and probably not even that much. So my approach is non-medical. I'm going to do as little medical intervention as I can in this labor of dying. We go through labor to get into this world, and we go through labor to leave it. And it is just as hard to leave this world as it is to get into it. And yet we, the watchers, realize that mom isn't dying like Judi Dench did on television when she said her profound words and then was dead, But when mom doesn't do that, then we think something bad is happening. We think something pathological is happening. When dying is hard work and getting out of our body, you have facial expressions, you have body movements. It's not pretty. It's not quiet. Yes, it can be, but generally it's not. But we don't know that because the movies, people don't die like that.
Thank you. I have this conversation often with people about how similar healthcare and prison are in terms of what people's ideas about them are. Because like healthcare, we see all these movies and films about prison and people who live in them. I had a doctor recently say that he was interested in volunteering at a prison, but he was afraid those people in the prison would disappoint him. And I thought, how lucky you are to be a person that's never been disappointed by the people in your life. That you'd have to go to prison to find that, but okay. But I also said to him, I'm kind of curious to you, like, where do you get these ideas about who is in a prison? And he said, well, from the movies and the TV I watch. And I said, how does that work for you, Doc, when your patient comes in and they've just seen Grey's Anatomy, for example, where they're, the 98-year-old grandma is just, brought in off the street with a major heart attack. She's resuscitated and bounces back like a piece of toast and then goes on to live her life the way she did prior to. And he's like, well, of course that's ridiculous. And I was like, it is ridiculous. And you might also think about what you're looking at in movies and TV about these guys in prison. But anyway, yes, so much of what we see on television is so not useful or helpful to us. And we get very confused about, we just had this conversation about do not resuscitate. And people not understanding that you are resuscitated once you've already died. And I'm personally like, if I'm dead, thank you, goodbye. I've had a great life. I am done. I'm so glad I was here, and I'm so glad I'm not here anymore. I do not want to be resuscitated at all. And I had to really put a note on my front door of my office when I was working at hospice, because I was on a floor with all nurses. I was like, if you find me face down on the floor, step over me and call my cremation place. Do not resuscitate me, because if you think I'm hard to work with while I'm alive, you have no idea how hard I am to work with while I'm dead. And I will come back and haunt you forever if you resuscitate me. Just a nod to getting your advance directives and having conversations with the people around you about what you might want and might not want.
And people don't realize the damage that being resuscitated causes, the broken ribs, all that physical damage that's added to what you died from in the first place.
Yes.
That no one tells you that.
Yes. Nobody mentions that. Yes. Let's see, get it pulsed. Yes. Thank you, Sally. Yes, people get it pulsed, get an advance directive. Let me see. I want to open this up now to see if there's anybody that would like to use their hand raising skill set in Zoom and ask Barbara a direct question. Barbara, thank you for being here. It's just, I'm so sorry about your allergies. It sounds awful. Yes, and thank you for DNR. Yes, allow a natural death. That is the new term that we've been using for the last 30 years, but only by people who work at end of life care and hospice. Sadly, not by healthcare providers. But one day that will also change, we hope. If people know, if you want to raise your hand by clicking on reactions or the more key down there, or if that is something that you're not able to find, if you just want to unmute yourself for a minute until I can find you. And then you can go ahead and ask a question directly without just having to type it here. Is there anybody? And meanwhile, we'll send a good thought to Cynthia's mom, whose birthday is today. Suzanne, I don't know if you want to put your video on, and then I can drop you down here with us. Thank you. I thought I could drop you down here. Let's see this. Here we go. Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you, and thanks. Great presentation. I apologize I had to join late, but Barbara, you are my inspiration. I quote you many, many times in my days. I have a new thing that just arose this week, and I plan to call the gal back, but she had just finished doing one of our surveys, and she wrote me a note, and it says, all of your hospice crew were great, awesome, loving, and caring. But there were a couple times that her daughter had left the hospital room to have, and she put in quotes, a secret discussion with either a nurse or hospice person. And I, as this man's wife, should have been number one contact and no secret discussions. She does state her daughter's the oldest child and tends to take over any situation. So just a note, I was disturbed by that and upset. I'm telling you this so in the future, it doesn't happen again to other family. My initial response is, I want to convey this message when I call her back. We respect and we'll visit with anyone. I feel really bad. It was a secret. It felt like a secret conversation. Maybe your daughter was protecting you too. I don't know. Do you have words of wisdom for me is my question, I guess.
I like what you said in that I think you have to confront in responding. I'm thinking, wait a minute. I would respond by saying, I'm sorry that you feel this way. And we will be aware to in future. But sometimes an individual family member needs alone time to talk to our staff, our people. We are here for the whole family, not just the primary caregiver. I'm sorry that you misunderstood that, and maybe go from there.
Thank you. That's what I was thinking along those lines, but I just wanted to bounce it off you. I want one more note, if I can take a moment too, is I truly believe that dementia patients, a lot more can get in than what they can get out. And part of my saying that is my mom had early onset Alzheimer's. And when she went to the nursing home, she really wasn't speaking much legible words. It was gibberish. But about 4 months after she'd gone to the nursing home, my dad was diagnosed with a colon cancer. And all of their married life, he had significant heart disease. He was a farmer, worked hard, but she always cooked well for him, worried about him. Well, because of his heart disease, everything was high risk. So he had to go to a large hospital for his cancer to see what the plan was. And I know when he went to the nursing home to say goodbye to my mom, he didn't think he was coming home. And that was a final goodbye. And things went well. And 3 weeks later, he came back into the nursing home. And we know that fear and anger bring out the clearest words with dementia people, but clear as a bell. She said, I thought you were dead. And then we fast forward 2 years later, and we're sitting vigil at her bedside, and she was hanging on for something. And it was like, I don't know what she's hanging on for. We've been there. Her sisters have been there, something. So I asked my dad that day, I said, did you tell her that you'll be okay? So I told her goodbye. I said, Dad, I really think you need to tell her you'll be okay. You know, I kind of used your words, Barbara, you know, I love you. I'm going to miss you. We'll be together again one day, but I'll be okay. So we made sure they had time alone that day. And he did say that, and she did die later that day. So I think it gets in, it just, they can't communicate it back. But thank you guys for all you do. Great work. You're my idol for sure. Thanks.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's a beautiful story. Thank you.
Thank you. Susan, I think you're muted.
Thank you. I am muted. Thank you very much. I was going to say, if there's anybody else that wants to raise their hand and ask a question like that, please feel free. Or if you'd like to continue to put things up in the chat, questions I could ask Barbara, I'm more than happy to do that. Denise, do you want to turn on your video, and then I can drop you down here in the spotlight?
Yeah, I happen to be disabled, so
That's okay. No
I
problem.
can hold my thing up very well. I have a question. Barbara, I highly love you. You're awesome. This is a different kind of question. A friend of mine who has cerebral palsy aspirated, and he got aspiration pneumonia. Okay. And they put him in hospice, and he came out of hospice. He's functional as much as he can be with his cerebral palsy. He's back in the room home where he's living. He's living with the feeding tube, which he had after his stroke. Because I have this innate curiosity in me. I want to ask him how hospice was. Because I just want to know, but I don't know what I should ask him and what I shouldn't. Do you have any guidance for me?
Well, I suppose it would depend upon how close of a relationship you have with this person. If you're very, very close, talk to him. You know, in a close relationship, you should be able to talk about anything. And you can also clarify and say, I wonder what you think, but if you're uncomfortable in answering it, then just say, no, I can't talk about it. Given the option of saying, no, I'm not going to talk. But, you know, if you have a close relationship, go for it. Ask him.
But because when I found out that he was in hospice, before I found out that he made it through hospice, one of my biggest fears was you can't understand him except for one word at a time, and it's a garble. And so I was afraid that they weren't understanding what he was saying, and he's as intellectual as I am, okay? And that was my fear, okay, without knowing the whole entourage, okay? So those are kind of things I want to know, kind of thing, but I kind of want to know what it was like and all that stuff, but I don't know exactly what to ask.
I would just be direct and just
Thank you.
ask him.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Denise. Okay, let's see. Anybody else have there was a question. No, somebody asked Barbara, for people that don't have family support, what, you know, kind of what do you suggest for people without family support? So much of, you know, when we talk about hospice, it's about the family being there to support the person. And so many folks are sort of solo.
Well, I think sometimes we're closer to people that aren't our family than we are to our own family. And I would say interact and share with your friend. You know, it doesn't have to be family. And so find a listener among your friends and say, I need someone to listen to me. I don't need answers, but would you be my friend to just listen and be my listener? You know, find that friend. Doesn't have to be family. There, like I said, I have friends that are as close as I am with my own family. And I think we all have friends that are that special. And you want them in your life, and you want them in the challenging times as well as the good times.
Thank you, Barbara. Here's an interesting question that I've never seen asked before. Have you ever witnessed a deathbed betrayal? For example, a family member makes an inappropriate confession to the dying person. How did you handle that? What's the impact on the dying person? You know, if you have any experience with this.
In the hours and even days before death, when the person is non-responsive, I encourage everyone present, whether it's family or close friends that are there, to go in alone and talk to the person who's non-responsive. I believe they can hear even though they can't respond. And I encourage families and close people to talk about the positive and talk about the negative, about the easy and the difficult times. Earlier, I said we're processing our life, that billion-piece jigsaw puzzle. And so I encourage people to talk about the most challenging times in the relationship. So I don't see that as a bad thing. I think that's a very healthy thing. And if you didn't have the opportunity to talk about your relationship, positive and negative, then you write the letter. You do the same thing with the letter and burn it.
Thank you so much. Anybody else here? You know, I'm thinking that question just, it reminded me of a patient that we had on hospice, and the chaplain went to visit him because he was, his wife said, having a very hard time dying. The patient just was ready to die but couldn't die. And so the chaplain finally went out, even though he was described as not a religious man, but willing to speak to the chaplain. And Evan went out to visit him, and the man confessed to him that within the first 6 months or a year of his marriage, which was 60 years or more at that point, he had had a one-night stand with somebody, and he felt that he should confess this to his wife before he died. And so he and Evan had a sort of soul-searching conversation about this, because he really wanted to unburden himself without, I don't think, really understanding the consequence that might have been to the wife. And Evan and he spent a lot of time talking about how that the result of that was that indiscretion resulted in him being devoted to his wife for the next 59 and a half years, providing incredibly well for his family, for their 4 children, and just being this remarkable human being, which the wife talked about all the time. And the man he decided that he would not tell his wife, but he asked for absolution from the chaplain. So I could have seen that going south in a way that would have been very disruptive for that family. But those conversations with spiritual care people on a hospice team can be really, really impactful, because sometimes it's not so much religious matters that really need to be talked about, but these sorts of things that people are sort of encouraged to impulsively say before somebody dies, because it's like the last opportunity they'll have to tell the person this, and may not be thinking that the person that's hearing it may be alive for another 20 or 30 years trying to navigate it.
Well, and who are we trying to make feel better? I think we're trying to make the person that's unburdening themselves.
Yes.
And I had a woman who, similar story, she'd had an affair and husband's now in the bedroom dying, and she said, I should tell him. And I said, why? You know, and we talked about it, and she told me rather than go in and tell him. You know, there was absolutely no benefit there for her to, except she would feel better. And we have to look at that.
Yes.
She needed a listener. Didn't have to be the husband.
Yes. Yeah. And, you know, I think that just really points, Barbara, to this idea of listening deeply, really, to what is it that the other person is really asking for, and that being able to hear, sort of let our ego take a nap there and just really hear what is happening for this person and what would be most beneficial to them and the person that's dying. It looks like we have about 3 minutes left, so I'm going to just ask if there's another question that anybody wants to ask. This is being recorded and this will be sent to you. Julie, I see that you have unmuted yourself. I'm not sure if that was done to ask a question. If so, if you turn on your video, I'll be able to drop you down in here with Barbara.
Sorry, it was inadvertent, Susan.
Okay. Do you have a question?
But
Okay.
no, but I just said earlier in the chat that the thing that we try and teach in this our last aid course about the death rattle is that it's a reassuring thing, because it tells you that that person is so deeply unconscious that they're not even aware of that little tickle of saliva or mucus at the back of their throat. So people should take comfort for it, and we certainly don't encourage medication for it. Physician can sometimes help, as Barbara said, but otherwise this has just been a great session, and I'm really grateful and wish Barbara felt better.
Actually, I don't feel bad. I'm just all gunked up from being outdoors, and
yeah,
I need to take some allergy pills.
Saline nasal rinsing is my recommendation. I've been a sinus sufferer for years, and that's the best thing I've found.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah,
Thank you, thank you.
good luck.
Thanks, Julie. Melissa Potts has her
Yeah.
hand up. And then Barbara, I'm going to ask if you might say a few words about your new caregiving endeavor, the work you're doing. Yes.
I'll be real quick because that really was what I wanted to kind of comment and ask about is the idea of the dementia doula, because the death doula movement has been so great and is now, of course, creating networks, and we're staying in touch. So I just wonder about the dementia doula. Do you see that as being another connected to maybe the death doula movement and using those networks? And just maybe any comment you have about that.
We so need dementia doulas, but we need them not just when the person is dying.
Yes.
We need, the families need this work, as well as the patient needs the support and guidance for years. And the Teepa Snow's Gems of Dementia, which go to her website and look that, those are amazing also. I hope that we can get more support for the area of dementia, for the patients, more understanding, more, and there's so many people that we need to figure out how to support all those caregivers that are taken care of.
It's tough. And Barbara, I think you're keynoting at our Missouri Hospice and Palliative Care Association. So we are so excited that you're coming. So thanks for saying yes to that. And we're just recruiting people to come and be there. So,
you know, oh, Matt, it's so funny that you brought that up, because I did all my work in Kansas City and in Olathe. And so I'm even coming in 2 days early so I can visit with friends and look at the house that I left, and, you know, all the stuff you do when you come to a city that you used to live in. So I'm excited about it.
yeah. Great. Well, so welcome home.
Yes, it will be welcome home.
Thank you. Barbara, is that where you worked with Pam Lee? Was she the social worker there?
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
so crazy. I worked in a hospice for years with this social worker who had moved from the Midwest. And then we had Barbara Karnes come to the other hospice that I went to work for. And Pam showed up. I'm like, what are you doing? She goes, Barbara and I worked together. He was the hospice nurse and I was a social worker. And I'm like, are you kidding me?
Yeah.
So it's a small world here.
When I left the first hospice that I've only worked in 2,
Yeah.
but I was the director of both of them, but she came with me. She wanted to come with me. And so she worked with me in both hospices.
Oh my God. Well, Barbara, do you want to just say a couple of words? I know that we are we're at the end of time. Well, not at the physical end of time. Being a literalist, I want to be clear about that. But at the end of our time together, do you have anything? I would like to get the resources from Julia for people to get the caregiving information. But could you talk a little bit about your project? I think you just put together some information for caregivers.
Okay, oops, there was someone that was there waving and had her hand up, and
Oh, that was Sally, yes.
okay, just so you know. We've got all these courses on end of life and end of life doulas and all of that. So I wanted to put information out that was easily understood, that whether you were a medical professional or whether it was your neighbor that was dying, that you could take and really learn from that course on what dying was like, about pain management at end of life, about how to care for someone at end of life. All of my work is like 5th grade level, short, simple, gentle. And so is this. So I would love it if caregivers that work in nursing facilities, in residential care facilities, that are shift workers in the home, I would love it if they would take this course, as well as mom is on hospice, or mom has a life-threatening illness and the doctors have said they can't fix her, whether she's on hospice or not. I would love to have those people take this course. It's not long, but it covers all the major areas that I think all of us should know, not just healthcare professionals, but all of us. So
Thank
you
you.
can go, I need to say, you can go to my website, bkbooks.com, and click on course. And while you're there, look at all my materials. And if you haven't signed up for the blog, I write a weekly blog on all kinds of stuff. So you can do that too.
Yes, and I'm going to put up the link here to the course right here for people to get it. And we'll also include that, we'll include that, Barbara, in the email that we send out to everybody about the link for the recording of this. So we'll include that information when we send that out to everybody. But I want to thank you so much for your time here today. It's always just such a pleasure talking to you and learning from you. And I so appreciate the work that you continue to do, helping people really navigate this death, dying, loss, and grief, which still seems, after 30 or 40 years of people really working hard to educate people in the world about it, still remains a mystery to many people. So I appreciate that you can be so clear and just so compassionate in the information that you're giving to people. And this will be sent out to Ken Ross, who puts this up on the YouTube Foundation. The Foundation's YouTube channel is out of town for about 2 weeks. He'll be putting it up and everything will go out in an email from Eventbrite or from my personal email. I will send you this and the resources, and Barbara, I'll send the link to the caregiving course out as well, and the information for people to be in touch with you via your blog or Facebook page.
Great.
Thank you
It's
so
always
much.
fun. It's always a delight to be here and converse and share ideas. Love it.
Love it too. Well, thank you. I'll be able to stay on for a couple of moments, not very long, for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes past the time I think Barbara needs to go. And thank you, New Zealand in the house. I was just in New Zealand earlier this year, and I just can't wait to go back there for almost any reason. Don't worry, you'll get the link. Thank you all. I'm going to stop recording right now, Barbara.
Okay.
And I will also send Julia the link. Thank you all for being here.
Bye.